express your opinion at any point in time. And so the paper that I chose was The Sex Brain Between Science and Ideology, dealing with potential innate cognitive differences between males and females, and also really dealing with the methodology in which the data is collected, either supporting or refuting that, and how much the answer is presupposed before the data is collected to begin with, and also how much the results, the conclusions are actually extrapolated from the data and how representative they are of what is actually in the literature. So, as you all know, in 2005, then the president of Harvard University, Florence Summers, wondered whether innate differences between men and women might be one reason fewer women succeed in science and math careers. There was a gigantic outcry over this statement. People were very, very upset, but then other people were also very supportive of it, and there was a great deal of controversy and discussion that this statement actually generated. Amid the controversy, he was forced to resign in 2006, and this really highlights the prevalence of this issue in academia, in higher institutions, and in learning in this country and across the world in general, that there does need to be a belief that there are actual innate cognitive differences between men and women. And so the first question this brings up is, well, are male and female brains actually exactly similar? And there are differences in male and female brains that are associated with reproduction. For example, the hypothalamus is associated with cycling in women. However, just because there are differences that are related to reproduction, that does not necessarily extend to differences also being related to cognition. And so that's really what the question that was being posed in this paper dealt with, and compiling all the literature to answer it. And so, just out of curiosity, how many people read the paper? Oh, wow. Okay. So there were three main questions that were asked in the paper. The first one was, is there actually a biologically based difference in language and math skills between males and females? I'm sure that many of you guys were familiar with the idea from small children that girls are better at language skills and boys are better at math. I grew up in a very progressive area of the country, in a very progressive family, and I was still exposed to that idea as well. So it's very prevalent, I think, in society. And so is there actually a biological reason for these differences, if they exist to begin with? The second question addressed was, how do testosterone levels influence financial risk-taking behaviors? And this was a question that really landed in the limelight once the stock market crashed. The soundbite that everybody loved throwing around was, if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Sisters, then the stock market went to the crash. And is there any data to support that, or is that just a snazzy-sounding soundbite? And the other question is, do males and females approach moral situations differently? And by that I mean, do males and females approach the judgment of moral situations differently? How do they come to conclusions about how much of a violation is going on in a moral scenario? And so the first question that she discussed was language between the genders. And as I mentioned earlier, then the idea that girls are better at language and communication is an idea that is pretty widespread in our society. And there was a 1995 fMRI study that offered a biological support for this. And the study found that males use their left hemisphere for language, whereas females use both their left and their right hemisphere for language. And so the thought process was, because girls are able to use both sides of their brain and they're making better connections, and this explains why they're so much better. However, it's really important to keep in mind that this had an N of 38. So 19 males and 19 females were studied, which is not a very robust sample size whatsoever. In 2004, then a meta-analysis was conducted on 24 such experiments, had an N of greater than 700 subjects, and it was found that there was no differences in activation between the males and the female subjects. There was so much variability between the individuals themselves that any differences that were first exposed in the initial study between males and females disappeared. So the individual variability outweighed any of the gender variability. And despite, yes?
Can you just say a little bit about how many people do you think you have to sample before you get a good idea of whether there'd be any differences? And also, can you talk about the meta-analysis? Like, my understanding of fMRI, which is poor, is that a lot of different labs use different techniques, so it might be really hard to do a meta-analysis anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just talk about that paper, like, just a little bit about how.
No, that's true. I mean, there are a lot of different techniques that they take into account. And I'm honestly not certain of the exact methodology that they used and how they controlled for that. But it is true that, you know, there are, were you raising your hand? Did you something to contribute there? No? Okay, sorry. I thought you were. But in regards to how many subjects you would need, well, the more subjects you analyze, the better in any situation. 38 seems to be, to me, a pretty low sample size, seeing as how it's 19 are female and 19 are male. So really, for each classification, you only have 19. But it is true that anytime you're doing a meta-analysis, anytime you're comparing studies between labs, also done at different points in time, then you have to take into account differences that would exist between the lab's methodologies.
So I would make one comment. The last statement seems to be unlikely actually supported by the meta-analysis, because what it's going to tell you is that the variability between experiments, between samples, outweigh gender variability. So gender variability is a fixed thing in all of those studies, but it's not actually going to be looking at individual variability, because it's going to be taking the variability within each study.
Right.
So really what the difference is, it says that the variability between experiments outweigh gender variability, which would fit with the whole issue about different methodologies and so forth. There's lots of ways in which you can get variability between studies that does not necessarily reflect individual variability as much as it reflects procedural variability.
But does your third comment a comment on the second comment? So you're saying that the meta-analysis found that the individual variability outweighs gender variability?
No.
So if she's not tying it to the second bullet point, then it's not necessarily about studies versus gender variability. There may be a study that looked at individuals. So on what do you base that third bullet point?
The third bullet point was based on statements that the author made in the paper that there was so much variability between individuals that the more individuals you looked at, then the less.
Yeah, she doesn't give a citation there, which
She
so I
does.
don't
It's
know.
actually Iris Summers' work, and I've heard Iris Summers present this. And the meta-analysis, I mean, I don't know the details of it, but she does go over how it was controlled for experimental variability. So it's not just pulled out of nowhere. So, I mean, it's a huge piece of work that took years to do, and there's 400 studies or something like that that are put together. And so, you know, it's credible. There's an article right here, I think it's number 33, Iris Summers, look it up. And so what she is arguing, in fact, is that there's more variability between individuals if you take the results from the meta-analysis versus if you were to say, you know, gender male, gender female variability.
Right.
This is what the paper is being forward. You're right.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And then the next question that she addressed was, are there differences in spatial cognition between the genders? And so, as I mentioned earlier, then boys are historically considered to be better at 3D orientation. And she even states in this paper, she says that experimental psychology studies show that boys do perform better in 3D orientation tests. But the paper that she cited was actually a 1995 meta-analysis. And that meta-analysis, when you look at it, refers to studies all from the 70s and 80s. So it's already dealing with a subject pool that is potentially very influenced by environmental expectations to begin with. But even taking that aside, even assuming that the statement that boys are better in 3D orientation tests is true, which there's not really very strong cognitive data for, even taking that aside, then why would that be? Is there actually a biological basis for that, even if that statement is true? And functional MRI and MRI don't really elucidate a biological basis for this difference. There's a lot of controversy, and it's pretty unclear when you look at different studies and different papers. There's not really a common consensus of what the difference would be. So there's not a biological, doesn't seem to be a biological correlate for this difference, even if it does exist. So,
could I ask a question about that? Are there any studies that deal with spatial cognition in fields that are specifically highly predicated on spatial cognition? I'm at the College of Architecture, for example, at Georgia Tech, and it's really interesting to me that there are certain fields where spatial cognition, where studies could really be usefully performed. Do any of those exist?
I'm sure they do. I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm sure they do, because that would be a perfect, like pool already to start examining. It'd be a self-selected pool, and it'd still be a perfect pool already to start examining the spatial cognition.
One could think of also geometry, anybody, working with geometries and so on, despite CAD or computer-generated programs, but
Video games.
I think that might really be useful, math.
Yeah.
What do you see when you look at your colleagues at Georgia Tech?
Do you mean all the male colleagues?
That's what I'm asking.
But I also have a number of female,
Yeah,
there are
but
also
I mean,
number of
is
female
there-
colleagues as
Is the
well.
field one that is largely male?
It is, architecture historically, but there are some very important, of course, as you know. I don't have the scientific answer.
Talking in statistics.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but there's still a social explanation for that, which is.
It's part of it, it's not the totality of it. But anyway, I'm sorry, I just wondered whether some of your studies or some of the, looked at that.
I'm not sure, but I'm sure that people have. I don't know this study.
Yeah. Yes.
And so then that actually goes into the question that was just raised. Well, is this difference based on biological reasons, or is this difference environmentally based? Is this a difference that exists due to society and societal expectations? And it's known that environmental factors really do have a very strong influence on cognitive development, and that it's also known that the manner in which a task is framed highly influences the output, and the expectations that you have of your subjects performing the tasks also highly influence the output that you get from them and how well they do on the task. And so the example that she gives in this paper was the geometry versus drawing task. And so in this task, then it was the exact same task that was being given to a group of students. And in one situation, they were told, well, this is a geometry task. And the boys drastically outperformed the girls. And then in the other situation, they were told, this is a drawing task. And any sort of gender difference disappeared. So the girls lived down to the stereotype that they weren't going to be good at the task because it was geometry, although they clearly had the actual cognitive ability and spatial ability to perform the task. But when it was framed in a way that it was something they were not supposed to be good at, that society expected them to be inferior at, then they performed in an inferior manner. So that just really highlights how much framing does influence what you end up getting out of something. And then the next point is that societal expectations, as I just said, really do influence the output that you get. And so in the first point, we're talking about like a specific situational framing, but society as a whole also really affects the output. And so there's a study that was taken across the totality of the country, 10 million students in 1990, that indicated that males outperformed females in math skills. And the exact same study was completed again in 2008, and this indicated equality between the genders. So in 18 years, then we went from males are better at math to males and females are equally good at math. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, there's not really any sort of biological change that could have happened across the entire country in females in those 18 years. There's not a genetic mutation that all of a sudden all females acquire. There's nothing that would fundamentally change in the biology of female brains in 18 years. And so that, of course, leads us to wonder, well, if there's not a change that could actually occur in the biology of female brains in those 18 years, then what's the difference? What accounts for this difference in these 10 million students of the females all of a sudden having the same math skills as the males? Go ahead.
I have a question about the geometry and drawing one. I don't think they mentioned it in the paper, but I wasn't sure if maybe you would know. It would seem that like also another contributing factor could be effort put into a task, or how much you actually desire to complete that task. So for example, if I was given something framed to me as a geometry task or something framed to me as a drawing task, I would do the drawing task more effortfully because I like to draw more than I like to do geometry. So do you know if they gauged interest level in the activity when they were doing
I don't think that they did gauge interest level, but even so, that still raises an interesting point that even if they don't take it into account, and if interest level is responsible for this,
Right.
then somehow the boys are supposed to be more interested in geometry and the girls are supposed to be more interested in drawing. There's already a different societal expectation there, even just with the interest level.
Right, so it could have a societal factor, but also just an intrinsic drive factor. What task I'm more
Yeah, I don't think they can look for that factor at all. Yeah.
So Claude Steele was here at Emory. I don't know if anybody saw his Yeah, so he does work on not just trying to figure out what might be underlying gender differences in performance, but also race differences, and his work has sort of centered around this idea of stereotype threat, and that you're not necessarily, it's not that somebody's overperforming, but that one group is underperforming based on these. So it's essentially what you just said, but it's really interesting because he's done studies that show that if you actually tell a group that's mixed gender or mixed race or whatnot, you know, the test I'm about to give you has been shown that there are no gender differences, then they will perform equally. And so and you don't even have to have done that. I mean, you just
tell
lie to
them.
them and tell them that
Yeah.
that's, you know, and they'll know that it's been determined that there are gender differences intrinsic in the way this test was designed. That stereotype threat goes away and they perform equally. So I was just wondering if that was mentioned, or I don't know. It's just
No,
a
she
comment,
does.
I
She
guess.
does talk about that, and
Yeah.
and you know the same thing's been done also when people are trying to show like differences between like cognitive ability between different races.
Right.
And the same thing has been shown that if you say, well, this test picks up a difference between people from like this socioeconomic class, people will go down to it. If you say that this test
It doesn't,
then it
Right.
brings it right back up.
Yeah.
I've read that even something as minor as asking the participant's gender before the task
Mhm.
was, which I thought was
Right.
crazy and interesting.
It brings it to mind. It brings it something that they're thinking about, but also makes something that they're thinking about in the context of, well, how am I going to do on this test? Like, why do they want to know that in relation to this test? Yes.
Is the bottom bullet point, is that the same exact study was given 18 years later? I wonder if the thesis of the paper that we read, though, is also submitting the idea that maybe the women's biology did change in 18 years because they were more included in the math classroom. I mean, isn't the paper about plasticity? So if it's the exact same test, couldn't there be some?
Right. So she talks about plasticity, but what I think what she meant was, but yes, she is talking a lot about plasticity. But I think she's talking about like an innate, like hardwired, quote unquote, deficit in female brains as opposed to male brains. So something that is completely like hardwired from birth. Yes.
If I could just write off of what Rachel just said. So I think this kind of dichotomy between, is it plasticity, is it environment, and if, is it biologically determined, is it, an essential biological difference. Some of the thinking that this writer is coming out of is talking about that it's not just, is it this or that,
Right.
but that in those 20 years, perhaps because the classroom environment has changed for young girls, that there will be some kind of biological effect of
The brain will
of
develop
that, right?
differently.
Yeah. So that's the argument I have with this paper, that it does seem to just fit in this way or that, and it doesn't take you to that next step.
Right, and that's that's true. But she does talk a lot about plasticity here and how what you're exposed to can affect how your brain develops.
That 2008 study has interesting results because the average difference between males and females disappeared compared to the 1990 study. But if you look at the tails of the distribution, the sex difference is still there. It's smaller, but the sex difference is still there. So it suggests this complex interaction between bias in the system and the effects of the environment.
Right.
So that you find, if you take the top 1%, 2% performance, that you have more males in that. It's richer in males than it is in females. But if you look at the average distribution overall, there are different big curves, and the end result is that the mean is essentially exactly the same.
Kim, there's a paper that just came out in Psychological Science that basically supports that. My understanding is that when you look at math, on the mean, but when you look at the, say, math geniuses, they tend to be predominantly male. And this fits in with the view I would have of this is, and Kim is expert on this, you start off with basically female brain, isn't that the view? And
But
what
you're
happens
talking about
is
that
that-
end of the bell curve, so if
Right.
you go to the other end of the people who are really poor at math are also males.
That's right.
Right, right.
So
But
you have to,
sure,
that
but why would
reflects
males
the
be much higher diagnosis of ADHD? Why would males have much higher diagnosis of autism? You see, so there's something going, we think those things are biological.
Yeah, the
So
fundamental
the
sex
notion is you
difference.
start with a female brain, and then you mess with it, and you end up with a male brain. And that's why you have much more in the way of ADHD, autism, and so forth in males and females.
Actually, as far as autism, and looking for, or ADHD, sorry, and identifying males versus females, it has been shown that there's a possibility that the tests that we use to identify those behaviors, so there are a lot of tests where we look at activity in the upper part of the body, and what was found that is that girls with ADHD actually were exhibiting it in lower parts of the body, and people that were measuring it in that one way actually were not capturing the female. So sometimes it's within study design.
The overall picture I got from this paper was one could take each topic and do an in-depth examination, just as you now bring up that paper that I didn't know about. Because each one of these is a large topic in itself. But what I saw overall this entire paper was a replay of something that I first saw, let's say 50 years ago. And it is it environment or is it biology? And I was there through the entire feminist revolution. And Debbie, I've heard you talk about waves. I don't know the characteristics of the waves of the feminist revolution. But I vividly remember early on there were women where there can't be any difference between men and women. I mean, that was their ideological standpoint. And I get a strong whiff of that in here as well. And so I just see the same thing being replayed, except substitute the word plasticity for environment or social milieu or culture. That'd be best. Substitute plasticity for culture.
I have two thoughts. The first is that possibly diagnoses are gendered in that boys will be boys and they're going to act out, and you know, ADHD and autism are are like activity related. The second part is that
Autism is not.
is that we are not yet living in a completely egalitarian society, which I think we can all agree on. So, in my mind, it's still really hard to dissect these studies.
Right. If we're still starting from a situation where the way that males and females are treated are in expectations are already not exactly equal, so you have to take that into account when you're looking at these studies. Yes.
I think part of the concern that's coming up in this discussion arises from the fact that the target of the paper is not entirely clear. So I think the author is vacillating a little bit between criticizing the scientific literature and criticizing the way in which the popular media is interpreting and promulgating certain findings from that literature. So I think that in the discussion about how correct her claims may be, since she hasn't, in my opinion, done a great job of clarifying her target, we should maybe talk more specifically about where is our target of interest, because the media, I think, at least from what I've seen, does generally a pretty terrible job of taking scientific findings and replaying them in ways that may not be correct.
Right.
I think it's a separate issue, the caliber of the science per se. So I just think that's an important point to keep in mind, in part because I think she's been a bit ambiguous about who she's really targeting. It's a different thing to criticize the way in which the popular media promulgates the findings than it is to criticize the people who are doing the basic research.
She's also against reductionism. I've decided Facebook is probably just a Marxist.
Catherine Vidal is not a Marxist.
Yeah, and one thing I want to mention is I think we've been drawn into a discussion of nature versus nurture, which I think we're all very familiar of the trajectories of the conversations, and I just wanted us to also keep in mind that I think at this point in our understanding of biology and the social sciences, many people have started to realize that nature and nurture don't exist in a vacuum, and it's not one or the other, that they interact with each other. Genetics do not express themselves in a vacuum, so we can't just talk about nurture or nature without nurture. So maybe we need to also talk about how variables interact instead of trying to isolate variables.
I'm sorry, I'm wondering if a way of getting around this question too is to think a little bit about neurodarwinism and the difference between the primary and the secondary repertoire as you're taking a look at this. That is the difference between 1990 and 2008. I thought you were sort of heading in that direction when you said that a lot of things, societally speaking, in terms of expectations, have occurred.
Right.
And say in neurodarwinism, it's precisely those social issues that somehow get back and shape your internal repertoire. That would be a way of getting out, I think, of that nature-nurture, that kind of dead end of the nature-nurture divide, because the two really do interleave.
What is neurodarwinism?
It's Gerald Edelman, who's written quite a bit about it, but there are quite a group in the neurosciences that call themselves neurodarwinists because they see the importance of societal impact. But the problem is, how do you show that? And Edelman has this, I think, very elegant theory where he says that we're all born with this primary repertoire, but that primary repertoire becomes shaped by the environments in which you exist. And when those impacts return, they shape what is called the secondary repertoire. And one can think more largely, it's that shaping of the secondary repertoire that's kind of changed between 1990 and 2008.
Also, this is still just saying that we can't yet tease apart nature or nurture.
Well, I think he's trying, and he has some lovely books. Wider Than the Sky is the one it's the one just before the last one from Emily Dickinson that I would really recommend. It's an elegant and very accessible sort of exposition of this problem, but it's a way at trying to get at some of the issues that are on the table right now without falling back into the old nature-nurture, and also to try and test it scientifically. I'm not in the position to go into all of that right now, but what I would say is I think that might be very, very useful. He's written quite a bit about it, but there is quite a camp of so-called neurodarwinists, which takes evolution, takes change into effect that is both naturally occurring and culturally provoked.
Well, if Emily Dickinson's about that,
Well, he takes that from one of her poems, wider than the mind is greater than mind, wider than the sky.
First book is generally considered to be incomprehensible.
Really? Well, this one's quite beautiful
So,
and
better with the
quite
later ones.
accessible,
I mean,
and also quite demanding in the sense that it's
Yes.
very, it's quite technical.
I have to tell you that most neuroscientists don't pay any attention to it. That's why you
I
haven't
would
heard
have
about it.
to debate with you on that, but anyway,
I think
sorry.
I have heard of it now.
Okay, but it's a major thing.
Oh, I know. He got the Nobel Prize, but it was in immunology.
Yes, well, that's right.
So we'll have to mark that on maybe a reporter thing to put a link to that book.
But there are later books. It's that one that I think is particularly deep and at the same time technical and at the same time accessible. But that really lays out this theory, which is what we're, I'm just thinking it might be a way to get out of this conundrum.
I think I saw another hand up here first.
I would just like to hear a little discussion about what we mean by biological influence. Because in reading this article, it turns out that Catherine is using, by biology she means genes. And you use the term hardwired. And from a biologist's perspective, that's not what biologists mean by a biological influence. Plasticity is a biological process.
Right.
Almost any phenotypic characteristic is the interaction of some bias, some biological bias, shaped by the environment. So this kind of effect it's a biological process.
Right.
But that doesn't seem to be what we're talking about.
Right. It's a biological process that is influenced by the environment, and I think that the point that she's arguing against in compiling all these papers together and in formulating, this analysis, is that this biological process does exist. The biology can be influenced by the environment, is influenced by the environment, but that innate difference that all females are inherently inferior to all males, that there is something that is static in your brain, that females and males differ in their cognitive ability. I think that is what she is arguing against.
So she's really arguing against a straw man, because I don't know anybody who argues that.
I think the innate is the critical point, that she's
The what?
trying to, innate,
Yeah.
that there's an innate difference, like at the time when they're born, their potentials are entirely different.
But let's take this example of this math difference, right? So what we see between, in 18 years, is we see a dramatic change in the average difference between men, boys and girls, men and women, right? But what we don't see is the same change at the tails. So the predisposition can be there, and it's shaped by the environment. And when you get to the extreme ends, either really bad or really good, they're overpopulated with males. That reflects what the bias in the system is. The fact the mean is fungible, that it can be changed as a function of experience, simply argues that that's not what the bias is determining. It's not determining average math performance, right? The environment's doing that. But you can take lots of biological processes and you see exactly the same. Take the sex difference in height, right? It's very sensitive to the environment. If you starve a boy and you feed a girl, she will be taller than he will be, right? Even though the bias in the system is for sexual dimorphism in size.
Can you clarify what you mean by bias in the system? Because in this context, it could mean two completely different things.
You mean innate?
I mean that there is some genetic process that, given the appropriateness of the environment or the expression of that genetic process, ends up biasing the system to grow in a specific way.
You had
I do have to run. My comment was just, I think the point that, folks have raised about it not being clear what the argument was, and that she's falling back on a type of understanding of feminist engagement with biology that is basically, there's no difference. I hate agreeing with you, but you're right. The fact of the matter is that where the argument has gone already in this scholarship is that there is going to be difference, but why we keep on kind of bringing gender as being the one, one of the main markers of difference when there's so many other reasons why people can be different, is that that's the kind of differences that we need to explore, not simply falling back on these gender differences. And I think she's actually talking about the politics of that. Why do we keep on going back to male-female difference when there's so many other measures of difference?
Right.
And that's all I'm going to say. I gotta go teach.
Thank you.
This is great.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we get kind of confused within that argument, particularly within the subsection on testosterone and economic behavior.
Yeah.
Because she kind of begins that section talking about the organizational hypothesis and saying, okay, this is how it's hardwired into the brain, which is kind of like a separate issue within itself. But then the rest of that subsection is on circulating levels of testosterone,
Right.
and how those how those predict economic behavior. When the connection between those two things is not necessarily clear. So if you're talking about the prenatal environment and those levels of sex hormones, and then going to make the jump between circulating levels of sex hormones, that's not a clear, that's not a clear bridge really. And so I think she kind of, at first, misrepresents maybe the organizational hypothesis. Like it almost seems kind of like a throwaway sentence in there of like, well, this organizational hypothesis came out, it was originally done in other animals, but it says that the brain, that these differences are hardwired and that they're determined by prenatal levels of sex hormones, which I think is, and Kim can definitely speak more to this than I can, but I think is somewhat of an unfair characterization of that hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
And also then saying like that this has been shown in other animals, but the evidence in humans is really scarce, and then supporting kind of that claim with pretty faulty, with studies that talk about circulating levels of hormones that were probably analyzed, she says, in like a variety of ways.
Right.
And so it just seems kind of like picking from the worst that there is and saying, well, this hasn't been supported in humans, and here are a few studies that speak to that, but those studies aren't really representative, I feel like, of that.
Has that hypothesis been supported in humans?
The organizational hypothesis. can do.
Strongly in support of?
Well, it depends on what you mean by strongly. The amount of experimental evidence is limited to natural experiments.
Right.
We get, and horrible medical mistakes. So it's supported. Is it demonstrated? No. I think that and there's still a lot of debate about whether the structural differences that were originally reported are consistent, whether you find them consistently or not. And we're at a place in terms of imaging where the resolution of the imaging systems is just not quite there to be able to ask the critical questions of are there structural differences that are analogous to what you see occur in animals when you give them different kinds of prenatal hormone exposure.
Jim, how about your monkeys?
About my
The little male and little female monkeys.
Yeah, well, I don't want to sidetrack the discussion. I think.
But you'd be saying humans are different.
No, I mean, in monkeys you see very strong support for organizational effects of hormones, and you see very strong support for sex differences. In a context in which we doubt that stereotype threat is a big deal in monkeys, and we actually doubt that gender stereotyping is a big deal in monkeys in the sense that I don't think any adult monkeys enforce gender stereotypes on juvenile monkeys. And they show these really striking behavioral sex differences, which I would argue behavioral sex differences are cognitive sex differences. They're all in the same environment, but they interpret the environment differently, and they produce different outputs to the environment. And that's a cognitive function. So when a female monkey is all of a sudden under the influence of her ovarian hormones becomes strongly sexually attracted to a male, that's a perceptual difference. That male hasn't changed. She's changed. And that suggests an underlying cognitive change that's influenced by the hormones.
Right. And I think those perceptual differences, I mean, you have perceptual differences that occur across the menstrual cycle, that occur between men and women. Like, we know that, basic thresholds of the sensory systems are different between men and women, and that's been shown, for many of the senses, is that organizationally, like, under the control of prenatal hormones, I don't know, but and it's shown that you can change that by administering exogenous or hormones from other sources, and like the birth control pill or postmenopausal women receiving treatments and things like that. And I think it's interesting that it seems like people are more comfortable with those findings of, okay, it's fine if men and women differ in something like the way that they're perceiving the world around them, but how can you really like divorce those two concepts of there are differences in perception, but there aren't differences. I mean, how we perceive the world is going to affect how we interact with that world, which is going to be exemplified in certain behaviors. And I don't think, there's no, like, women can smell a lot of odors better than men, but that doesn't mean that women are better than men, So it's like, in fact, like, that could almost be an advantage if there was some terrible odor. But I think it's interesting that, like if it's something, very sort of removed from the media, like limelight, like who cares about threshold, like auditory evoked potentials, or, like olfact, or like how well you can smell something, if you remove that, it doesn't seem to invoke as much kind of like
Ire and fire, yeah. Go ahead.
Like to teach class.
I guess I think it gets so tense because all of this scientific data then is used to justify various social programming and social inequalities. So perhaps the tendency.
These are what you're really talking. It's all about power.
It's
That's
all
what
about
it's really
power.
all about.
So I think the tendency maybe in some early feminists was to say, well, no, there are no differences.
I can
But
understand why they
as a
would.
response to
Yeah.
the fact that differences are used to justify.
But I think that in a subsequent
political
generation, you had
equality.
a more nuanced view, and then we're going to be the expert. Maybe Smiley's going to be the expert.
But yeah, so but I think even things like, differences in auditory things are used, for example, in the single-sex that kind of evidence is used contemporarily in campaigns for single-sex education in public schools.
Really?
And to argue things like, well, I don't know about,
there's argue things like, for the classrooms for boys, like teachers need to use a different frequency of their voice, speak louder or softer for the girls, things like that. And I think the problem is that when the scientific data is always about averages of populations, but then that gets applied in the real world to all members of that population as opposed to seeing variability within the population, and to justify the sort of social and political inequalities.
So I think you raise a really great point. The question is, why has dealing with the social consequences essentially failed? Although I don't think it's completely failed. If you look at these two studies, it shows that in fact it hasn't failed. So if the issue is the social consequences of the existence of differences, that seems to me that that's a choice you can make independent of the data.
Yeah, that's what I think.
And so why is it that we don't focus in that direction and saying, okay, so how do we deal with each one of these situations? Instead of saying, no, there are no differences. Because that's the other way of preventing it, is to just deny that there are any differences.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in this pattern where people say, no, there's no differences, and so then other people come and say, well, there are these differences, and therefore, I mean, Larry Summers is a, kind of poor example, but therefore, perhaps, maybe there should be less funding for STEM, women in STEM program, like less funding for programming designed to encourage women to enter STEM fields.
Except it's exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
There's increased funding.
Well,
right?
maybe he just was very poor about it, so.
I would actually say Larry Summers was a good example because he wasn't doing a prescription, he was trying to do an explanation. And unfortunately, it was interpreted as if he was limiting it, but he wasn't. He was just saying, this is why maybe there are more, but that doesn't reduce the amount of funding that's, so.
No, I mean, not like he specifically was calling for less funding, but just sort of that's how it could be taken up, that's how it can be taken up, and I think was taken up by some people to say that why are we spending this money on trying to encourage women to enter STEM fields? But that is ultimately going to be a failure because
It could be extrapolated to like the most serious consequences. Yes, is that what you're saying?
yes.
Laura?
Yeah, I guess just on the topic of, the way that we frame biological differences between genders and why those sorts of studies are so fraught, just sort of makes me think about, like, people seem highly motivated to investigate whether or not there are these gender-based differences, but there are so many other areas where differences are apparent that are less, that somehow seem less salient to us. For example, we were talking about rates of diagnosis of ADHD and how they differ between boys and girls. They also differ based on the age of the child. So I think this was on Neuroskeptic, and I don't remember the original source. Somebody, graphed the prevalence of ADHD diagnoses in third graders, I forget the exact age, some elementary school age, by birth month. And the ones that were born such that they were the youngest kids in their class had a higher diagnosis rate, and it just had a downward trend toward the oldest kids in the class. So the older, more mature kids were better at sitting still and less likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. Handedness is another example, and Cordelia Fine in her book, Delusions of Gender, has a great extended analogy about handedness. Like, imagine if we lived in a society where every pregnant woman is asked, like, oh, do you know if it's gonna be right-handed or left-handed? Like, because there are definitely cognitive differences that can be observed in handedness, right versus left-handed individuals. Rates of schizophrenia diagnosis are higher in left-handed people, but we don't see news articles in the Huffington Post every day about left-handers. What's so weird about them? A few maybe, but people are less motivated to ask those kinds of questions. People don't ask well, should left-handed people be allowed to run for president, given that they're so different from right-handed people? So,
and you can make all the same arguments about well, if I start playing guitar and suddenly I'm better with my left hand, so I have plasticity that's letting me change regardless of whether I was hardwired to be left or right hand. And you have all the fMRI studies, which always commonly use right-handers, and so those results are skewed. So it's a metaphor really about the analogy.
Yes. I think that, so of course it's important to look at how the science is being portrayed to a bigger audience, but I don't think we can ignore that science is untouchable. You know, it's being conducted by human beings. They have different motivations for endeavoring to do whatever they're doing, and they have different biases when they come to their analysis and interpretations of the data.
You have design of the experiments.
Right.
Yes.
A couple quick things. First of all, to respond to what you just said. In sociology, we have an idea of a master status, and that is the status by which people first interpret you and then interpret everything else through that status. And in every society throughout all of history that we've ever explored without exception, gender is a master status, perceived gender is a master status. And so to just suggest that left-handedness has a social equivalent or could possibly, we can look around the room right now and determine perceived gender status of every person in the room, and none of these other traits. So there are a lot of reasons why gender status has kept, whether it should or not, whether you make a judgment about the propriety of that, it always has, and as far as I can perceive, almost always will, and we ourselves are dressed in gender typical, mostly, you know, we adopt these roles and we accept them. Now, it isn't always a master status. For example, disability can trump gender. If you see someone in a wheelchair, it's their wheelchair status that is your first perception in gender, then it takes it. So master status can change, and it can change. So race is a master status in some societies and not in other societies, right? But gender always has been and probably always will be, and it's a little bit disingenuous to suggest that we should try to just let go of it and think about other things when it's so prominent in our life course and the way in which we behave and in social organization. And then the second point I wanted to make is we people in academia and scientists think that scientific findings generate social beliefs when it goes the other way around in many different ways. First of all, based on what someone said, societies determine, all scientists are social products of the societies in which they were. So scientists tend to explore the kinds of questions that the societies in question think are interesting and important. Look at how many people are looking at ecology and environmental and sustainability studies now compared to 30, 40 years ago, when actually things were worse in terms environmentally in many ways, but it just wasn't in the ether, in the scientific ether, that was an important question. A lot of people believed it was, but it hadn't convinced everybody. So we generate these scientific findings and we think they should change what people believe about gender, when in fact people are out there with all their beliefs, and this is just one more input that they selectively accept or reject for confirmation bias purposes. So if they already believe it, they'll look for the studies that confirm it. So, you know, we have to look at this, and there's an enormous historical generation coming into the argument. There are subcultural beliefs that come into the argument. It isn't as simple as, well, they discovered this finding and therefore everyone will now believe, you know. So, and the very last thing about that is the long historical and very powerful set of beliefs about gender that many of which we now reject, other of which we're arguing about, create a historical memory in which all of this operates. So the bias towards believing, the null hypothesis that there is no difference, to me seems a very fruitful one. That is, that should be the default hypothesis as far as I'm concerned. Because when it's not the default hypothesis in public thinking, then you get really bad biased public policy. And so I would advocate that we always start with that assumption. And then when we find the differences, fine. But it's actually, socially speaking, not necessarily scientifically speaking, a much more productive way to think about science as social policy and science in the public sphere, to promote ideologically the null hypothesis as the beginning of every conversation.
That might be a good place almost ends.
You know what? David is going to write a blog about this and try to synthesize it as he does as our trusty reporter. And you will all be invited to comment there, and you can extend the conversation there. So thank you very much for a very productive conversation.